Hey, Lindsay, how's it going?
Good, thanks.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so today we are talking about depression.
Mm.
So let's talk a little bit about the kind of symptoms of depression. So for people that are listening to this that might have, ever felt or experienced these symptoms, and how they relate to depression, let's talk a little bit about that. Mm,
So I guess as a concept, this was constructed within a sort of psychiatric paradigm that
mm,
would seek to try and label and make sense of this is what this problem is, this type of problem, and then that opens up treatment options. So under the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual DSM-5, which is a psychiatric kind of handbook, we would be thinking about changes in a persistent low mood, changes in sleep, changes in appetite, changes in levels of energy, difficulty with concentrating, and that would be present for more than 2 weeks, and that it would have an impact, a negative impact on our functioning. So
mm,
that's, I guess, quite broad,
mm.
but certainly that is the definition that we
Yeah,
have at the moment. Oh, and I don't know if I mentioned a loss of pleasure. That's quite a
yeah.
key one. So things that we may previously have enjoyed, we don't derive the same kind of enjoyment from those things.
Yeah, it's kind of like a real sense of just the color's been sucked out of life, the
Mhm.
blarness of everything. And I suppose there's different types of depression as well, or this sense that you might be feeling a bit depressed. There's the, a grief. You've had a
Mhm.
loss and you're grieving. That's not a disorder, but it can tip into a sort of depression if it's prolonged or very complicated. Then
Mhm.
there's also a burnout, and distinguishing that sense of I don't feel pleasure in anything from burnout, because sometimes if we've had a sustained overload, people can, I suppose, misread it as a depression and treat it accordingly, but it doesn't necessarily need to be thought of that way. So distinguishing, okay, this is I'm burnt out. The next is you've had some kind of trauma or something quite traumatic has happened and your whole nervous system is shut down. That's also quite different to like straight depression. And then some kind of very specific relational injury, be it a
Mhm.
divorce or a relationship breakdown, be it friendship, etc., can also kind of lead to that. So let's just talk about some of the kind of things that might be clinical depression versus a sort of more contextual depression.
And I think if we think back to the list of things that are in the diagnostic criteria, it doesn't take a huge leap of the imagination to think that those different scenarios that you described, when that can hit us
Mm,
so very hard, and those aren't things that we get over with. And it talks about for more than 2 weeks. We don't get over those kinds of things in 2 weeks.
mm,
And so it's thinking about it's not hard to imagine how we might be experiencing life and difficulties in life, both the contextual things you listed, but also it could be chronic pain. It could be, we're living with stigma or harassment or other so many other things that just cause chronic stress on
mm,
us.
mm,
And then I think what we know is that the way we try and cope might then also perpetuate some of those cycles. So typically, what we would see in both contextual and clinical depression would be a withdrawal, which I
mm,
also think makes complete sense because being out in the world, being around people is not easy. So it makes more sense. It feels more restorative to step back to conserve energy. And that in itself then might leave us with more time on our hands to think about the things that are going through our minds. So that would be called rumination. And often,
mm.
the more time we have ruminating on difficult thoughts, difficult experiences, difficult self-talk, that can almost then become the fuel for the cycle, and it can be an ongoing, perpetuated state. So we would
Yeah.
often think of clinical depression doesn't necessarily have to have a cause and a point of onset, but a contextual depression, we might be able to more clearly see a link to something that has then set a person on a path where they then end up experiencing the same kind of things that we would see in clinical
And I
depression.
and I think just you know, pivoting off your point that you've just made, it's there's some situations in life that are just really awful.
Mhm.
And you know, responding in a way where you are withdrawn and kind of a little bit ruminative and, experiencing a sense of loss or grief or downness is appropriate. It's normal. And I think it's when it becomes problematic when it's a very prolonged experience, when you can't seem to find a way to get out of this place. Like your inertia, it's like a ship that has just ground to a halt. And you know how much energy it takes to get that ship going again. I think that's really where it starts to become problematic.
That stuckness that you're talking
Mm,
about, that yeah, then that almost becomes self-sustaining, and then we almost can't step out into something else. Even
yeah,
if we might have thoughts we want to, it almost becomes too, there are too many barriers and it feels too difficult and too unwelcome. So
yeah,
then we kind of, our bubble shrinks and shrinks and shrinks.
yeah.
But I do agree with you that absolutely sometimes that initial response of stepping away from the world is absolutely necessary.
Mm,
But when that's where we stay, that's when it can become more problematic for a person.
yeah. And I think if we just circle back to the previous episode where we were talking about the compass of shame from Nathanson, we can really kind of end up going round and round in that kind of compass where we can't get out. And, just to remind listeners of the four parts of it is that when we get stuck in a kind of shame cycle, and there's a sense of first this sort of avoidance of the world, and then this kind of withdrawal from, whatever's kind of affecting us, then perhaps an attacking of self, negative self-talk, and then attacking of others. So sometimes a depressed person can be quite angry and quite attacking. And that's
Mhm.
sometimes what depression can look like. And we need to remind ourselves that, regardless of somebody's behavior, we don't actually know what's going on under the surface. And, that's why having some compassion for others is helpful. But
Yeah.
when we're stuck in that cycle of shame, it's hard to get out alone. And I think that's a really important thing when your ship has ground to a halt, you're stuck in this cycle and you're starting to worry about yourself. I think that's the point at which it's actually smart to kind of raise your hand, it takes courage and say, hey, something's not right here. I need to
Mm.
talk to somebody about this.
Something really, really popped up when you said about how it might look different in some people. And I think if we were to, take a stereotype view of what depression looks like, people might think of it more of a sadness feel to it, or a tearfulness, or a shutdownness. But you're absolutely right. For some people, that level of difficulty can look quite different. And I think that sometimes it's more easy to miss that the person is struggling with those types of feelings, because on the surface, it doesn't look like it. And that kind of
Mm.
has the effect of pushing people away in the same way that avoidance pushes people away. Anger often pushes people away. So it's not forgetting that the behavior on the surface might belie something very different underneath.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most depressed people I ever worked with would have this little giggle all the time. But it
Mhm.
but the nature of that kind of giggling was, okay, that's enough, don't inquire, leave me alone,
Mhm.
push back, I'm
Mhm.
fine. It was a kind of avoidance kind of behavior,
Mhm.
protection behavior. And underneath it, incredible despair,
Mhm.
So I think the thing is as human beings and how we travel through life is not to make too many assumptions about
Mhm.
others, and their behavior, because, and to sometimes just think about, hey, something doesn't feel quite right. Your behavior on the surface looks jolly or looks angry, or, and I've kind of just, well, you're just an awful person and you're bad mood, but something doesn't feel right. And I think that's where, as human beings, to lean into something doesn't feel right, that moment of actually just checking in on somebody could be really life saving.
And it might be checking in or it may not be that we have that sort of a relation with the person. It might be that's the point at which we extend compassion, because
Mm.
we may not know, or it may not be appropriate to ask. But just thinking, if something doesn't feel right, not to read too much on the surface behavior,
Yeah.
and just, yeah, I guess holding some compassion that something different may be going on for that person.
Mm.
It took me back to the idea of masking
Mm.
as often being such a central strategy for people just to survive, just to keep going in a world.
Mm.
And some of the times that that's been most talked about has been where there's perhaps people have died by suicide that are quite famous, or particularly if they're comedians, or quite well known as being jolly, funny people, as you talked about. And that then being a real shock at the despair that is held underneath the surface, because it's such a mismatch from the perception that we may have had. And just as you say about strategies for keeping people away or keeping things just easy, or managing, is, I think, really helpful to hold in mind that we never really know what's going on for someone. That doesn't mean we can start going around asking everyone, because sometimes people might just be in a really great mood and just be really,
Yeah.
in a great space.
Yeah, not all
However that
jolly people are depressed, to be fair.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
But and I think it's very hard to know, because how a person will hold their pain and where they feel safe enough to show what they're feeling will be very different for different people. And I think if it doesn't feel safe to show your pain or allow your vulnerability to come out,
Mm.
a person will use a number of strategies to keep themselves safe. And that might be pushing away, hiding, masking. There's lots of different ways
Or
that can look.
staying super busy. That's
Hmm.
another thing as well, is, never having any downtime. There's always got to be a podcast on, or noise, or can't
Hmm.
seem to kind of just, drink a cup of tea and stare out the window. It just can't settle the nervous system. That could also be a sign that there's some kind of, dysregulation underneath that you're not addressing. And I think, I mean, psychology conceptualizes depression very differently to psychotherapy. From a psychotherapy lens, we very much see depression as a kind of self disorder, some sort of challenge with how you see yourself. It's some, cognitive dissonance with how you see yourself. You're not comfortable with yourself. And I think if you think a little bit about that, it's not feeling safe, not feeling comfortable with self, perhaps even in relation to others.
Mm.
Often what's at the source of that is something we call pathological accommodation, where people
Mm.
are just super accommodating, people pleasing, and doing whatever they need to do to maintain that connection within a relationship. And perhaps they're not able to be fully themselves, fully authentic, advocate for their needs getting met, say no, set a boundary. These things take courage. And sometimes if we don't feel settled and confident with ourselves, it can suck all the, joy out of life. You just, well, what's the point? I don't even exist. No one even pays attention to me. Or you're in a situation where for whatever reason, you feel like the world is attacking yourself, like who you are, whether that's based on, you know, a disconnection with others, or it's some kind of issue where the world doesn't accept you as you are, or you are
Mm.
yourself in dissonance with your sexuality, your body, how you feel, your color of your skin, whatever it is. If you have an issue somehow with yourself, don't love and accept yourself, that can tend to cause some of the symptoms of depression.
Mm. And I guess that speaks, and I know we'll come a bit later to thinking about what might be some of the approaches,
Mm.
ways forward, what might help. And what you've described there from a psychotherapeutic point of view would be in many ways similar to how we would hold it as psychologists, which would
Mm.
be thinking about a formulation and really understanding the narratives and what's sitting underneath it, the kind of the psychological makeup of the person, and understanding that whole picture. And from a psychiatric point of view, it would be more this is the name of this is, the label we would give to the thing, and this is the treatment. Certainly doesn't necessarily mean that no therapeutic input would be there, absolutely not. But also thinking about pharmacological interventions would be offered most likely from a psychiatric perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, for
But it
sure.
is
And I
interesting, isn't it, how even something conversation that we're having today, there are so many different ways in which professionals conceptualize it, and that then shapes how they would support someone and work with someone around it. So I think, this understanding of what is this thing that we call depression, really does differ between professionals, groups of professionals, but I imagine also within groups as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, if you wear different hats as a clinician, it's also not necessarily just focused on, well, my tool set or whatever. You also got to lean into what's appropriate for the actual patient or the client. I mean, some people, to get out of their depression, there's certain, strategies that work for one, but it doesn't work for the other person.
Mm,
And I think that's where, you've also got to realize that if you've tried something and it didn't work, don't worry. There's
mm,
lots of different treatments that are out there, and it might be, I mean, one of the biggest predictors for success is the relationship that you yourself have with
mm,
your therapist or your psychologist or whoever it is that you're working with.
mm.
I mean, that's kind of the most important thing. So if you didn't get on with the person, don't worry, just keep going, go find somebody else.
Keep shopping around. And it is
Yeah.
something, the interesting thing about the research, which gives us such valuable insights, it also, that the limitations of research is that in order for the researchers to be confident that this is about a person who's experiencing depression, is they have to make sure that everyone in the research trial only experiencing depression, not other things as well. Otherwise, you can never be sure what is the thing that's influencing how this treatment is affecting or impacting or helping the person.
Mm.
But what it also means is then back in the world of kind of supporting people, working in the healing professions, rarely do people just have one type of problem. People
Exactly.
often come with experiences of trauma, or with physical health conditions, or with relational, contextual issues. So we find that the research so important to draw on, but also I guess we then have to think about, well, there might be an evidence base for this type of presentation, but the person I'm working with also experiences this, or also relates to this. So we kind of, I guess, have to then think about how we are working with a whole person once again, because often, people have complex and complicated set
Absolutely.
of histories that they bring with them.
And I love the way, another hat for me is in health psychology, and I love the way health psychology conceptualizes human beings and challenges that they have. It's like we're a lake, and there's lots of rivers feeding into the lake, and
Okay.
it's kind of this. I think whether you're a psychologist or a psychotherapist, it's this detective type vibe,
Mhm.
curiosity. Well, psychotherapist would be more about curiosity, but we've got to have the curiosity to swim up all the rivers and find the source of things. And I think, there's many reasons someone might be feeling the symptoms of depression. They might be experiencing perimenopause and going through hormonal dysregulation, and that's a known symptom for a lot of people. And the treatment is very different over there. And then it might be that they're inflamed, their bodies are inflamed, and that could also, there's the gut sort of hypothesis related to depression in the brain. So it's kind of, it could be inflamed, or it could be a relational issue. It could be how you're attacking yourself. It could be, something you're feeling like a minority in the world, or you're feeling a grief or a trauma, or something has just hit, or there's something from the past you're not quite complete on, and you're ruminating and agonizing. Or it could just be you hate your job. There's so many different things. And I think just to trust that if you've tried one thing or swum up one river, don't be disheartened or lose hope. Because there is, I think, one of the key parts of recovery is, and to not collapse, is to keep having hope. Okay, that didn't work. It's okay. We're going to try something else. We're going to do something else here. Because I think the thing is where it can tip over into something that is really dangerous is when people really lose hope.
I mean, that's one of the biggest risk
Mm.
predictors. And I get it in that if you were swimming up lots of rivers, each time you start on a new river, you would be hopeful that this might be the path that helps things to feel like they get better or to resolve. And you're absolutely right. There are so many things that can look like or mirror those symptoms that we described about, that I guess we kind of need to get to what is the one that is going to start making a difference.
Yeah.
Or it might be that we need to work on things from multiple of the streams all at
But
once in order
but
to get the benefit.
but equally, sometimes we can be too accommodating, trying to fix and turning ourselves into a really strange pretzel to try and fix all the things to maintain a situation where actually with contextual depression, the situation you're in might be the issue. So, for example, if you're in a marriage and you're trying everything to save this marriage, and you've had 10 years of therapy and you've done all the things, it's like maybe the solution is to let go. Maybe this is actually the solution here. And I think, or you're in a job that you hate, or such, so you're stuck in something you can't stand. It's sucking the life out of you. Perhaps the situation itself is the issue.
And I would imagine in a therapeutic interaction, when those topics are explored, when the person's whole life is considered, it then starts to emerge the experience of being in that relationship or of being in that job. And that
Mm,
can then, I guess, bring a person to a clarity
mm.
around, is this something that can be improved, or have I, with everything that I've tried so far, is actually setting a boundary or protecting myself in a different way what's necessary?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So look, I mean, if we look at some of the kind of the treatments and what's out there that has an evidence base and it has been
Mhm.
successful. I mean, obviously from a psychiatric lens, there was the serotonin hypothesis of depression, which is ultimately that, okay, it's just a neurotransmitter in your brain that isn't working properly. So what we do is we just stop the reuptake of it, and
Mhm.
antidepressants are going to be fantastic. And unfortunately, in a massive umbrella study in 2022, they found that this hypothesis was nonsense and they debunked it. But antidepressants still save lives, right?
Mhm.
And they still
Mhm.
actually, they haven't found anything sort of alternate. So people still prescribe it. And if you are depressed, you still go on antidepressants. So it still works.
I tend to think of it almost as scaffolding. So
Mm,
if you were needing to make repairs to a building, sometimes you can't do that without some scaffolding, or it
mm.
would just feel really incredibly difficult and unattainable to do the repairs up high without the scaffolding. However, equally, putting up scaffolding doesn't in itself do the repair work. So there's something about if antidepressants help make it feel more manageable to do the things that then help you get in a different space with yourself, with your life, then that's a great combination. But I think that, yes, sometimes a person finds them incredibly helpful, but they're not necessarily the answer if it was the only thing that
And
changed
I
for the
think,
person.
what antidepressants actually do is they knock out all emotion, basically. And
Turn
they
down the volume on everything. Yeah.
exactly just knock everything out. And for people that are constantly feeling this pit of despair or emptiness, that's like life-saving. That can actually be really, really helpful. But depression is often shaped by far more than just one neurotransmitter. And I think the treatment must reflect this level of complexity,
Mhm.
So it's actually, to your point, I love how you say scaffolding. It's like, while something's tying you over, okay, now what is actually the treatment? And I mean, the most successful treatments for depression are psychological and therapeutic. It's actually
Mhm.
going to work and basically doing that detective work and figuring out,
Mm.
swimming up all the rivers and figuring out,
Mhm.
is this contextual? Is this overall? Let's talk a little bit about some of those treatments that have
Mm.
made a difference.
And I guess it very much would depend if you were working with someone. It would be getting to know the person would determine what might be the way forward. But certainly, I think one of the most common from the realm of cognitive behavioral therapy would be behavioral activation,
Mm.
which sounds really fancy, but I guess in simple terms, it's getting going. So
Yeah.
we know that one of the most common patterns in a depressed state is withdrawal and just stopping and not doing. So this is about actually getting going, reactivating, and starting to do things, even though it may feel difficult, even though you may not feel you want to. It's kind of getting that inertia into a different space, because it's very hard to create opportunities to do things that can bring us more joy, that create more energy and momentum when we're in that very stuck state of inertia. So you would often be looking at kind of tracking, doing quite a lot of really starting to become your own detective and thinking about, when I do different things, how do they affect me? Are there different times of the day where things land differently? So a real invitation, I guess, to start to pay attention in a different way to how
Mm.
what you do and who you're exposed to impacts how you're feeling.
Yeah, and I think, also in the realm of psychological is acceptance and commitment therapy,
Mhm.
particularly, which is a nice, I think CBT and ACT go so well together in a way, and also dialectical behavioral therapy, but they go so well together because there is this sense of taking some action and sort of looking at the thoughts behind it. Is there a diffusion of thoughts, or what's the unhelpful thinking pattern that is contributing towards this, and then taking this action, even if it's hard, and noticing the effects of that. So it's like a scientist, kind of like you're doing an experiment on yourself. Right, we're getting going, let's see what happens. And one of the best interventions in the getting going land is actually exercise.
Mhm.
There's so many studies now that show that just walking, jogging, yoga, something, just getting moving, and you're moving your body and that
Mhm.
kind of change of state of body can so influence the mind. And I think there's been some great research on that as well.
And there are now so many more options for when we say movement about what that can look like.
Mm.
It no longer needs to be going to a gym, because that can raise all sorts of, have lots of barriers for people for different reasons. So any kind of moving our body, physically becoming more present in our body can be really helpful. And as you were talking about ACT, I think one of the things that I find most helpful from acceptance and commitment therapy is refocusing on our values and what really matters to us. So that can really help when the thing that we think would probably be a good thing for us to do feels hard to do or unattainable or unappealing. When we connect it to something that matters to us
Mm.
more, it makes it much more like we can see why committing to that action is actually driving us towards something that we really want for ourselves longer term, which I think helps us get over that distinction between short term, that might be really challenging, but
Yeah.
actually longer term is taking us to where we want. And I think we're not just talking about getting going with action that's just for the sake of
Random.
doing
Yeah.
something. Yeah, it's actually really thinking about what reconnects us to meaning in our life, what matters to us.
Yeah.
And I think that brings that into really sharp focus.
And I think in addition to that is also the sense of, you know, doing it and also with a frame of self-compassion. Like the
Mm.
self-compassion focused therapy is really, I mean, it's groundbreaking with depression work in particular. It's just that loving kindness with yourself,
Mhm.
and that helps coming out of that kind of compass of shame of attacking yourself and withdrawing and all that. It's sort of like it's kind of multi-system, the
Mhm.
treatment of depression. You got to kind of look at it a little bit again, like, okay, well, let's talk a little bit about your day. What are you doing in your day, and how are you filling your day, and what does your morning look like, and what are you having for breakfast and how's your lunch, and like, so some
Mm,
nutrition can really influence it. Movement can
absolutely.
influence it. And then how much of your life are you living in accordance with your values and things
Mm,
that actually matter to you? If a lot of your life you're being accommodating to others and you kind of lost yourself a little bit or folded yourself into a weird pretzel, this is where the treatment actually takes courage. It's like,
yeah.
okay, I'm going to take a stand. I'm going to do something different here. Yeah.
When you mentioned compassion focused therapy, I mean, we talk
Mm,
about how in the last episode we were talking about self-compassion. And
mm,
I mean, I don't like to make sweeping statements, but I think when someone is really stuck in a sort of an intractable position of feeling really depressed, the self-talk probably isn't all that compassionate. And it's not just like, "Do you know what? Just don't do anything today. Just stay here and that'll be fine." We are often beating ourselves up, trying to kick ourselves, trying to, be very critical of what we're doing. And so compassionate perspective, that CFT lens can be really helpful both to
mm,
soften our self-talk and our inner critic, whilst also thinking about one of the other systems that has the drive system. How do we get going? How do we start getting a sense of accomplishment to get those sort of dopamine-based experiences? And I think one of the things that's so important to hold in mind with depression is making it relative to what is attainable at the moment. So it might be that just getting up and having a shower for the day is something that has been actually quite a stretch for a person.
mm.
Great. That let's recognize that then as pushing ourselves and achieving something. So it can be very small things. And it's about, I guess, making the steps manageable and doable from
And
the point of the person.
celebrating those steps. It's like for somebody that their ship has ground to a halt, getting up and having a shower, that's a bloody victory,
Mhm,
and it's not a small thing. And I say that with great compassion and
mhm,
understanding for what it
mm,
sometimes takes people to just kind of get up and do something. And for people that have the courage to keep going and showing up and going to their job and and they just feel nothing, or they feel dead, or they feel
mm.
so much grief inside. Amazing. The resilience of people to be able to do that. So I think it's also the celebrating of the wins, or the commending of the person. And sometimes that, to your point, can help soften that self-talk too.
There's a sweet spot, isn't there, between celebrating the small wins and not feeling as though this is not something that should be celebrated. This is so small. I never would have thought this was an achievement, if you'd asked me from a year ago. But really, I think that validation that comes from recognizing how hard we are pushing ourselves
Mm.
to break that inertia, that's really something to be recognized.
I think the opposite of depression is not it's not just happiness. A lot of it is agency and actually authorship over one's life. So if you look again, one of the treatments is obviously psychotherapy, and actually taking time to really unpack and swim up every single river. I mean, we don't all have the luxury to do that, but it's also an incredible treatment for depression in terms of figuring out who I am, what is myself, making
Mhm,
peace with myself, feeling at home with myself again, and actually having agency and drive, and like, this is what, back to act, this is what I care about, and I'm starting to now align my life in alignment
mm,
with what I care about and what my values are, and I have some meaning and purpose and agency. I mean, these are the kind of ingredients of what, someone is just the opposite of depression has, is that sense of, this is what my life is actually for. Mm,
And I think those are the very things that a person can feel robbed of when
mm,
they're in the pit of that, really in the grip of that inertia. Um, yeah,
mm.
absolutely. And I think the journey to connecting to those things will contain so many of the other ingredients. I don't think there's any one psychotherapeutic model that doesn't have overlap with so many of the others, but certainly that exploration and reconnection to self
Yeah,
is, yeah, real way
beautiful.
forward.
Good. Okay, so that's probably a good place to leave it for today. So I think in our next episode, we're going to look at the emotionally unstable personality disorder, which used to be called borderline personality disorder. and kind of cover a little bit the variations of mood and how that can kind of really impact people. So yeah, that's it from us today. And next time we will muse and continue musing things, health, relationships, and trauma. Thanks again. The information shared on the Naked Insights podcast is for educational and information purposes only, and is not intended as a substitute for professional therapy or counseling. While we aim to provide helpful and accurate insights, individual experiences may vary. If you're experiencing trauma, mental health issues, or distress, please seek guidance from a qualified professional. The views expressed by us as the hosts are our own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions or positions of any affiliated organizations.